I still remember the exact moment I realized something was deeply wrong with my inheritance, not because of paperwork, but because of what I saw standing where my land used to be. A public park does not appear overnight on private land unless someone believes they own more than they legally do. My name is William Hayes, and I had just inherited 9,400 acres of rural property outside Travis County, Texas, land that had been in my family trust for generations, untouched except for farming leases and conservation boundaries clearly recorded in county files. I had come expecting quiet fields, tree lines, and old fencing that marked the history of ownership, but instead I found paved walking paths, public signage, playground structures, and a fully operating recreational park filled with people who clearly believed they were allowed to be there. At first, I thought I had the wrong location, because nothing about what I was seeing matched the legal description I had reviewed weeks earlier in the probate transfer documents. Families were walking dogs along maintained trails, children were playing near a constructed lake viewing area, and maintenance crews were actively servicing park facilities with official-looking uniforms that referenced Willowbrook Reserve Community Development. The name alone was enough to make me stop walking. Willowbrook Reserve was the same homeowners association listed in nearby suburban filings, not in Rural Land Development Authority, and certainly not in any document tied to my inherited acreage. I stood at what looked like a main entrance gate, complete with a decorative archway and signage declaring public access hours, and I felt a growing disconnect between what I legally owned and what was physically operating in front of me. I called my attorney from the edge of the parking area, my voice steady but increasingly controlled as I described what I was seeing. He asked me to confirm parcel identification numbers, which I read directly from the county documentation I had brought with me, and after a long pause, he told me something that immediately changed the tone of everything. There was no recorded easement granting public access, no county-approved recreational conversion, and no valid transfer of use rights to any homeowners association or third-party organization. What I was standing inside of was not a public park under legal authority. It was infrastructure operating on private land without enforceable authorization. I walked slowly through the entrance path, observing how deeply the assumption of legitimacy had already taken hold. There were directional signs pointing toward picnic areas, restroom facilities, and community event spaces, all installed with the confidence of permanent approval. Yet none of it matched the legal reality I now held in my hands. As I moved further inside, I noticed a central administrative kiosk where staff were handing out maps and explaining park rules to visitors, all under the belief that they were operating within a properly designated public recreation zone. I did not interrupt them. I simply observed, because at that moment I understood that this was no longer about confusion or misunderstanding. It was about a system that had been built outward from an assumption that had never been legally validated, and I knew that the next step would not be about asking questions, but about restoring alignment between recorded ownership and physical reality. I did not fully process what I was seeing on that property until I walked deeper into what was being presented as a completed public park, because the scale of it forced my mind to separate what was legally possible from what was physically in front of me. My name is William Hayes, and I had spent the last hour moving through what appeared to be a fully operational community recreation site built directly across multiple sections of my inherited 9,400 acres, complete with paved walking paths, maintained landscaping, parking areas filled with vehicles, and organized activity zones that suggested long-term public use rather than temporary occupation. The deeper I moved into the property, the more detailed the infrastructure became, including information boards describing environmental restoration programs, community engagement events, and municipal-style guidelines for park usage, all of which implied an official approval structure that I knew had never passed through any county authorization tied to my land. I stopped near a central lake viewing platform where families were gathered, and I observed how naturally everyone moved through the space, as if the legitimacy of the environment had already been fully accepted without question. That was the moment I understood the real problem was not what had been built, but what had been assumed before anything was built. I stepped aside from the main walkway and called my attorney again, this time providing him with visual confirmation of structures, signage, and operational staff activity. I described everything in detail, including the presence of what appeared to be a community management office located near the main entrance, where employees were distributing maps and answering visitor questions about park rules and scheduled events. My attorney asked me to send immediate photographic documentation, which I did while walking slowly along the perimeter of the constructed zone, carefully avoiding interruption of ongoing activity. Within minutes, he called back with a level of urgency that had not been present in our earlier conversation. He confirmed again that no recorded easement existed for recreational development, no municipal transfer of land use had been filed, and no homeowners association or third-party organization had legal authority to convert private acreage into public infrastructure. He explained that what I was standing inside of was not a recognized public facility under county jurisdiction, but rather a large-scale, unauthorized occupation of private land operating under the appearance of legitimacy. As I continued to move through the park, I began noticing inconsistencies that had not been visible at the entrance. Certain structures appeared newer than others, suggesting phased construction without centralized approval, and some boundary transitions between natural land and developed areas were abrupt, as if the expansion had followed assumption rather than surveyed limits. I passed a maintenance crew working near a landscaped section, and I noticed their equipment carried branding associated with Willowbrook Reserve Community Development, the same entity referenced in the entrance signage. I did not engage them, but I carefully observed how structured their workflow appeared, as if they were operating under an established municipal contract rather than a disputed private claim. By late afternoon, I reached a higher elevation point within the property where I could see the full extent of the constructed park stretching across the valley below, including parking areas, recreational fields, and walking trails extending far beyond what I had initially observed at the entrance. From that vantage point, the scale of the situation became undeniable. This was not a small encroachment or isolated misunderstanding. It was a fully developed system built on top of private land under the assumption of authority that had never been legally granted. I stood there for a long moment, not reacting outwardly, but processing how far the situation had progressed before any verification had been requested or enforced. And in that silence, I understood that the next phase would not be about discovery, because everything had already been discovered. It would be about correction, and that would require shifting the entire structure from assumed public use back to recorded private ownership under law. I remained inside the boundaries of what was being called a public park until the late afternoon, not because I believed the situation required more observation, but because I needed to understand how deeply the system of assumption had already rooted itself in a physical reality before any legal correction could take place. My name is William Hayes, and as I moved back through the constructed pathways of the so-called Willowbrook Reserve Community Park, I began noticing how normalized every layer of the operation had become, from directional signage and maintenance schedules to staffed information kiosks that were actively managing visitor flow as if the land had always functioned under public administration. Families continued to move through the space without hesitation. Children played near constructed water features, and scheduled activity boards listed events for the upcoming weeks, all reinforcing the perception that this land had already been fully converted into a lawful public facility. I stopped near a central administrative structure that functioned as a control point for the park, where employees were coordinating maintenance tasks and providing information to visitors, and I observed how confidently they referenced park regulations that were entirely based on internal organizational structure rather than any visible county jurisdictional framework. That was when I realized the most dangerous part of the situation was not the physical occupation itself, but the administrative certainty behind it, because every action being taken inside this space was built upon the belief that authorization had already been granted somewhere else. I stepped outside the main walkway and contacted my attorney again, this time sending him live updates and additional photographs showing the operational scope of the park, including its boundaries, internal road systems, and public access points. I described how deeply integrated the infrastructure had become, noting that it was no longer a temporary construction zone, but a fully functioning recreational system with ongoing visitor activity and staffed operations. My attorney responded with immediate concern, explaining that he had already escalated the matter to county records review and that preliminary verification still showed no easement, no municipal transfer of use rights, and no legally recorded approval for any recreational development across my inherited acreage. He emphasized that what I was observing was not a public facility under lawful jurisdiction, but a fully operational system functioning outside of recorded authority boundaries. As I continued walking toward the outer sections of the park, I began to see how the layout had expanded in phases, with certain areas clearly integrated more recently than others, suggesting incremental development without unified legal clearance. I passed several signage clusters that referenced Willowbrook Reserve community development programs, all of which framed the land as part of a broader community initiative, yet none of which contained any reference to county authorization or recorded ownership transfer. By early evening, I reached a transitional boundary where the constructed park began to blend into undeveloped land, and the contrast between natural acreage and engineered recreation space became unmistakably clear. I stood there for a long moment, watching people continue to move through the developed areas without awareness of the legal uncertainty underlying the entire structure. In that moment, I understood that the issue was no longer about what had been built, because it was already built, but about what legal system had been bypassed to allow it to exist in the first place. And as the light began to fade across the property, I recognized that the next stage would not involve observation or documentation, but formal legal intervention to reconcile physical reality with recorded ownership, because no structure, regardless of how complete it appeared, could remain valid if it existed outside the boundaries of verified authority. I did not expect the situation to escalate through legal channels as quickly as it did, but by the following morning, the entire structure of what I had been observing inside my inherited property had already begun transitioning from passive documentation into active enforcement review. My name is William Hayes, and the first confirmation came when my attorney contacted me before I even arrived on site, informing me that the county had formally opened a jurisdictional enforcement case regarding unauthorized land use tied to Willowbrook Reserve community development. He explained that the review was no longer limited to verification of easement absence, but had expanded into full assessment of unlawful public infrastructure operation on privately recorded acreage. When I arrived at the property, I immediately noticed a shift in atmosphere compared to the previous day. The park was still operational, but there was a subtle difference in how staff and visitors were moving through the space, as if the certainty that had previously defined the environment was beginning to erode under the presence of external scrutiny. I parked near the main entrance and observed how informational staff were still providing guidance to visitors, but their tone and pacing had changed, becoming more cautious, more measured, as if instructions were now being filtered through awareness of potential administrative intervention. I walked slowly toward the central administrative kiosk where I had seen coordinated activity before, and I noticed additional paperwork being reviewed by staff that appeared to reference internal compliance checks rather than standard park operations. My attorney called again while I was inside the perimeter, informing me that county officials were preparing to conduct a formal site inspection to verify the operational basis of the entire recreational infrastructure. He emphasized that this was not a routine inquiry, but a jurisdictional validation process designed to determine whether any portion of the constructed park had lawful grounding in recorded land use permissions. As I continued moving through the park, I began observing small but significant changes in behavior. Certain areas were temporarily closed without explanation, maintenance activity had slowed, and some visitors were being redirected away from sections that were previously fully accessible. I stopped near the lake viewing platform where I had first fully realized the scale of the situation, and I watched as park staff gathered in small groups near administrative points, reviewing printed documents and communicating with increasing urgency. It was clear that internal systems were reacting to external verification pressure, and that the assumption of uninterrupted authority was beginning to fragment. I took additional photographs and recorded updated observations, focusing on the contrast between fully operational sections of the park and areas that now appeared to be under internal review or restriction. My attorney later explained that county enforcement had escalated the matter due to the scale of unauthorized development, and that if verified as lacking legal authorization, the entire park infrastructure could be subject to immediate suspension pending corrective action. As I moved toward the outer boundary of the property, I noticed that certain access points were being monitored more closely, with staff positioned near entrances that had previously been open without restriction. The change was not dramatic, but it was structural. as if the system that had been operating under assumed legitimacy was beginning to reconfigure itself in response to external legal pressure. I stood at the edge of the developed area for a long time, watching both visitors and staff move through a space that no longer felt stable in its operational certainty. And in that moment, I understood that the situation was no longer defined by what had already been built, but by whether any of it could withstand formal legal verification once county authorities fully engaged with the record, because every system built on assumption eventually reaches the point where documentation determines whether it continues to function or collapses back into its original legal boundary. I arrived at the property early in the morning expecting procedural updates from county enforcement, but what I encountered instead was a fully shifting operational environment where the park no longer functioned with the same confidence I had observed in previous days. My name is William Hayes, and the first indication of change was the reduced flow of visitors at the main entrance, where staff were no longer operating with the same open distribution of maps and guidance materials, but instead appeared to be managing controlled entry points with noticeably stricter oversight. I parked near the outer access road and walked toward the entrance gate, observing how signage that previously welcomed public use now included additional notices referencing internal review procedures and temporary operational adjustments. The tone of the environment had changed from expansion to containment, and that shift was visible in every layer of activity I passed. My attorney called while I was still outside the main entrance, informing me that county officials had formally escalated the investigation into unauthorized land use and were preparing to initiate a structured enforcement review that could include full suspension of all park operations pending legal determination. He explained that the focus was now on verifying whether any portion of the Willowbrook Reserve community development infrastructure had ever been granted lawful authority under recorded county land use approvals. As I entered the park, I immediately noticed that certain sections were closed off with temporary barriers, and maintenance staff were redirecting visitors away from areas that had previously been fully open. The atmosphere inside the park felt noticeably different, not because the structures had changed, but because the certainty behind their operation was no longer stable. I moved slowly through the central walkway, observing how internal staff were no longer referencing scheduled community programming in the same confident manner, but instead appeared to be reviewing documents and communicating in lower tones near administrative stations. At one point, I stopped near the Central Lake area where I had previously observed full public activity, and I noticed that seating areas had been partially cleared and that signage referencing scheduled events had been temporarily covered or removed. My attorney contacted me again while I was documenting these changes, informing me that county enforcement teams had begun preparing on-site inspection protocols designed to verify the exact legal basis of every constructed element within the park. He emphasized that this process would not be influenced by operational appearance or public usage patterns, but strictly by recorded land use authorization and deed-based rights. As I continued toward the outer boundary of the property, I observed increasing coordination among staff members who were now gathering near administrative points and reviewing printed materials that appeared to relate to compliance verification rather than routine park management. The contrast between earlier operational confidence and current procedural uncertainty was now clearly visible across multiple zones of the park. I paused at a transitional boundary where developed infrastructure began to blend into undeveloped land, and I noticed that even visitor movement had become less fluid, as certain paths were partially restricted without formal explanation to the public. Standing there, I could see the full scale of what had been built, but also the beginning of what was being questioned under formal authority review. And in that moment, it became clear that the situation had moved beyond observation or documentation, because once county enforcement fully engaged with the legal record, every structure within that space would either be validated through recorded authority or forced back into compliance with the original property boundaries that had never legally changed. I arrived at the property for what I already understood would be the final phase of observation before full legal closure, not because anything remained uncertain, but because I wanted to witness how a fully operational system responds when its assumed authority is replaced entirely by recorded enforcement. My name is William Hayes, and by the time I reached the main access road, the change in the environment was already undeniable. The Willowbrook Reserve Community Park no longer functioned with the same open continuity I had seen in previous days. Instead, the entrance area had been restructured into controlled access points, with visible enforcement signage indicating temporary operational suspension pending county-level review. Visitor flow had decreased significantly, and staff members who had previously managed public engagement were now positioned in administrative clusters, reviewing documentation and communicating in measured, cautious tones. I parked near the outer perimeter and walked toward the main gate, observing how the transformation from public-facing infrastructure to restricted legal oversight had begun to take full effect. My attorney contacted me shortly after I entered the perimeter, informing me that county enforcement had officially escalated the case into full jurisdictional intervention status. He explained that this meant all operational activity within the park was now subject to comprehensive legal review, including verification of every constructed element, access route, and administrative authorization tied to Willowbrook Reserve community development. He emphasized that this was no longer a preliminary inquiry, but a structured enforcement process designed to determine whether any portion of the infrastructure had been built under valid recorded land use rights. As I moved through the park, I noticed that previously active areas had been partially secured or restricted, with certain pathways blocked off and signage either removed or covered with temporary compliance notices. The atmosphere inside the park had shifted from confident public operation to procedural uncertainty, and that shift was reflected in the behavior of both staff and visitors, who now moved with visible hesitation through spaces that had once been fully open. I stopped near the central recreational lake where I had previously observed full community activity, and I saw that sections of seating and viewing platforms had been cleared, while maintenance teams worked quietly under revised instructions that no longer referenced scheduled public programming. My attorney called again while I was documenting these changes, informing me that county officials had begun on-site inspection procedures, including boundary verification, infrastructure mapping, and legal cross-referencing against recorded deed filings. He explained that the objective of this process was to establish a definitive alignment between physical construction and legally authorized land use rights, without consideration of prior assumptions or internal organizational claims. As I continued toward the outer sections of the property, I observed how the structural integrity of the park's operational system was beginning to fragment under the weight of verification. Staff coordination points were now focused on document review rather than visitor management, and internal communications appeared increasingly centered on compliance interpretation rather than routine administration. At one transitional boundary between developed and undeveloped land, I paused and looked across the full expanse of what had been constructed, recognizing how completely the system had operated under assumed legitimacy prior to enforcement engagement. And in that moment, it became clear that the entire situation had entered its final stage, because once county enforcement fully aligns operational reality with recorded land authority, every structure, no matter how complete or widely used, must either be validated through legal record or systematically returned to the boundaries that were originally defined in law and never altered by assumption. I arrived at the property for what I understood would be the final operational phase before full legal resolution, not because there was anything left to observe in terms of discovery, but because I needed to see how a system behaves once enforcement is no longer theoretical but fully active within its jurisdictional scope. My name is William Hayes, and by the time I reached the main access road, the transformation of the Willowbrook Reserve Community Park was already complete in its procedural shift. What had previously functioned as a fully operational public recreation space was now under visible county enforcement control, with clear signage indicating restricted access, temporary suspension notices, and official presence marking the transition from assumed community operation to formal legal review. I parked near the outer boundary and walked toward the entrance, immediately noticing that visitor access had been significantly reduced and restructured into controlled entry points monitored by staff who were no longer operating under normal park management protocols. My attorney contacted me as I crossed the main entrance threshold, informing me that county enforcement had formally escalated the case into active jurisdictional control status, meaning all infrastructure within the park was now subject to comprehensive legal inspection and verification against recorded land use authority. He explained that this stage of enforcement was focused on establishing definitive alignment between physical construction and legally recognized property rights, with no consideration given to internal organizational claims or assumed public use designations. As I moved deeper into the property, I observed how the operational structure of the park had begun to fragment under enforcement oversight. Areas that had previously been open to public use were now partially closed, with barriers placed across walking paths and signage either removed or replaced with temporary compliance notices referencing ongoing county review. Staff members who had previously managed visitor engagement were now positioned near administrative points reviewing documents, coordinating responses, and communicating in lower tones that reflected procedural uncertainty rather than operational confidence. I stopped near the central recreational lake where I had previously observed full community activity, and I noticed that seating areas had been partially cleared while maintenance teams worked under revised instructions that no longer referenced scheduled programming or public events. My attorney called again while I was documenting these changes, informing me that county officials were conducting full site inspection procedures, including boundary verification, infrastructure mapping, and cross-referencing all constructed elements against recorded deed filings and land use records. He emphasized that this process was not interpretive, but strictly evidentiary, meaning every structure would either be validated through legal documentation or classified as unauthorized construction subject to corrective enforcement action. As I continued toward the outer sections of the park, I observed how internal coordination had shifted almost entirely away from public operations and toward compliance management. Staff gatherings were now focused on document review and verification discussions, and visitor movement had become noticeably restricted in certain zones without prior notice or explanation. At one transitional boundary between developed recreational infrastructure and undeveloped land, I paused and looked across the full extent of the constructed park, recognizing how complete the system had appeared only days earlier compared to its current state under enforcement scrutiny. The contrast between assumed permanence and verified authority was no longer theoretical. It was visible in every restricted pathway, every paused operation, and every administrative shift occurring across the site. And in that moment, it became clear that the situation had fully entered its final procedural phase, because once county enforcement completes full alignment between physical land use and recorded legal authority, there is no remaining space for assumption, only documented validity or mandatory correction back to the original legal boundaries defined in county records. I arrived at the property for what I understood would be the final confirmation stage of the entire enforcement process, not because anything remained uncertain, but because I wanted to witness how a fully constructed system behaves at the exact moment it is formally resolved back into recorded legal boundaries. My name is William Hayes, and by the time I reached the main entrance of the Willowbrook Reserve Community Park, the transformation was no longer partial or procedural. It was fully executed across the entire site. County enforcement presence was visible at multiple control points, and the entrance area that once functioned as a public access gateway had now been restructured into a regulated perimeter zone with clear restrictions and official notices indicating legal review completion in progress. I parked near the outer access road and walked toward the gate, observing how visitor flow had been significantly reduced and redirected away from previously open recreational areas. Staff members who had once operated under community park management were now positioned in formal compliance roles, reviewing documents and coordinating with county officials in a controlled and highly procedural environment. My attorney contacted me as I crossed the main boundary point, informing me that county enforcement had officially transitioned the case into final execution status, meaning all findings from the jurisdictional review had been confirmed and were now being converted into formal corrective enforcement actions where necessary. He explained that this stage represented the final alignment between recorded property ownership and physical land use, and that any infrastructure not supported by verified legal authorization would be subject to removal or suspension under county authority. As I moved deeper into the property, I observed how the park had been divided into clearly defined operational and restricted zones. Certain sections that had previously been fully active were now cordoned off with temporary barriers, while signage had been replaced with compliance notices referencing ongoing legal closure procedures. The atmosphere throughout the site had shifted from operational uncertainty to procedural finality, where every movement and activity appeared governed by enforcement oversight rather than internal administration. I stopped near the Central Lake area where the largest concentration of infrastructure had once been active, and I saw that maintenance teams were no longer performing routine operations, but instead documenting existing conditions for final record submission. My attorney called again during this observation period, informing me that county officials had completed full structural verification of the entire park, including boundary confirmation, infrastructure mapping, and legal cross-referencing against recorded deed filings. He stated that the findings confirmed a complete absence of lawful easement or authorized land use conversion for recreational purposes on my inherited acreage, meaning the entire constructed system existed outside recorded legal permission frameworks. As I continued toward the outer perimeter of the property, I noticed that visitor access had been reduced to controlled exit pathways, with staff guiding remaining individuals out of restricted zones in an orderly and non-disruptive manner. The operational identity of the park was no longer active, but transitioning into closure protocol under county supervision. At one transitional boundary between developed infrastructure and undeveloped land, I paused and observed the full scale of what had once functioned as a complete public recreation system now being reduced to documented infrastructure awaiting final administrative resolution. There was no confusion among enforcement personnel, no ambiguity in procedure, only the consistent application of recorded authority over physical presence. And in that final observation, it became clear that the entire situation had reached its definitive conclusion phase, because once enforcement fully aligns physical reality with legal documentation, every structure that lacks recorded authorization is no longer a functioning system, but a record awaiting correction under the boundaries originally defined by law. I arrived at the property one final time after receiving confirmation that the entire enforcement and legal review process had reached its administrative conclusion, not because I expected any further changes, but because I needed to witness how a fully constructed public system dissolves back into recorded legal reality once every layer of assumption is removed. My name is William Hayes, and by the time I entered the perimeter of the Willowbrook Reserve Community Park, the transformation was complete in a way that no longer resembled uncertainty or transition, but final resolution. County enforcement presence remained visible but no longer active in intervention, instead functioning as documentation and verification oversight while the last stages of compliance closure were being completed. The park that once operated as a fully active recreational facility now existed in a controlled state of legal deactivation, where access points were being systematically managed and infrastructure was being assessed for removal or formal reclassification under county record authority. I walked slowly through the main entrance where I had first observed the scale of the operation, and I noticed that all public access functions had been fully suspended, with signage replaced by official closure notices referencing final jurisdictional determination. My attorney contacted me as I crossed the central walkway, informing me that county enforcement had completed all verification procedures and issued final determinations confirming that no recorded easement, municipal transfer, or legally authorized development approval had ever existed for the recreational conversion of my inherited 9,400 acres. He explained that the entire structure had now been classified as unauthorized land use under county property law, and that all remaining infrastructure would be handled through formal removal or restoration procedures governed by recorded ownership boundaries. As I moved deeper into the property, I observed how the park no longer functioned as an operational system. Maintenance crews were not performing upkeep, but rather documenting final conditions, while administrative staff were gathering records and coordinating closure protocols under strict enforcement supervision. The atmosphere had shifted completely from active public engagement to procedural conclusion, where every movement was guided by legal finality rather than operational intent. I stopped near the Central Lake area where the most visible infrastructure had once represented full community use, and I saw that seating areas, pathways, and activity zones were now empty, with only structural remnants remaining as physical evidence of what had previously operated under assumed authority. My attorney called again during this observation and confirmed that county records had been fully updated to reflect enforcement outcome, including formal recognition that the land had never been lawfully converted into public use at any stage of development. He emphasized that this conclusion was not interpretive, but based entirely on verified deed records and jurisdictional authority alignment, meaning that all previous activity on the property had been operating outside recorded legal boundaries. As I continued toward the outer perimeter, I observed the final stages of site normalization, where access routes were being closed and boundary markers were being re-established in accordance with original survey documentation. The presence of enforcement personnel had diminished, replaced entirely by administrative closure procedures that focused on record completion rather than physical oversight. At the highest point overlooking the property, I paused and looked across the full expanse of land that had once been transformed into a fully operational public park without legal authorization. What remained was not conflict, not disruption, and not even recovery, but full restoration to recorded ownership reality. And in that final moment, it became clear that the entire sequence had resolved exactly as legal systems are designed to function when applied without delay, because once documentation, enforcement, and jurisdiction align completely, even the most established physical structures cannot persist outside the boundaries of law.